Hello and welcome to the Tillage Edge with me, Michael Hennessy. This is your regular update for all your tillage news and advice. A wet and windy May fills the barn with corn and hay is an age-old saying that farmers use, especially during a wet May. However, this wet period also brings a higher level of risk from foliar disease in crops, and this can certainly impact on yield later on in the season. So today I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Stephen Kildea of Teagas to chat about how disease control has gone through the season and is there anything to worry about all the way through to the end of the season. Stephen, I just first want to chat to you about maybe a recap on the season all the way up into May and how disease levels have progressed through crops.
Before we even get started into that, we have to look at the weather conditions and the climatic conditions that have prevailed over from autumn through to winter into spring. And this year, in terms of the growing season, has been sort of a very mild, almost benign sort of weather conditions. And these have been ideal for the various different diseases that we have to tackle. So taking that into account, then we also look at the sowing dates and I suppose the varieties that would go into the ground. And they've all sort of exacerbated to a certain extent what the weather has been doing, because look, some conditions in, I suppose, the back end there last year were very good. So a lot of crops went into the ground very early. And then I suppose when we look at the varieties that we have, unfortunately, a lot of them have some susceptibility to some disease. So we almost were starting in sort of a conditions that, look, we could expect quite a few diseases to develop. And with that, then we can go through the various different crops and the diseases that we would expect to see. We've seen to a certain extent. And I suppose the first ones that would start to spring to mind straight away in barley will be BYDV. And I suppose early sowing crops down along the coast started to show the typical symptoms of BYDV in late spring. And I suppose that's just reflection sowing dates and the mild winter that we had there also.
But Stephen, in terms of foliar disease for the likes of winter barley, I mean, growers would probably tell us this year that, God, it's been a very easy year. There hasn't really been any great problems and they got all the way to the end with pretty much very clean crops. Would that be the case?
And it is the case, actually. When we go into, I suppose, a lot of the commercially treated crops, they are actually very, very clean. And I suppose we can look at them and sort of say, okay, from an untreated perspective, and we have the ability to do that in our trials here in Oak Park and on the different sites we have. And we can see that actually there's quite a bit of disease there in the untreated. So basically, it is a case that actually, treated are looking well. And where, I suppose, programs and sort of measures have been in place to manage those diseases, we have been able to get on top of them. Where they've been allowed to develop, and I think sort of like, again, it comes back to the conditions and the variety, etc. I think if, say, something like cassia that we would have a lot of trials on here, it's very easy to find a lot of rhynchosporium, even up onto the leaf 2 and onto the flag leaf at this stage, and we're only starting to enter grain fill in there. I suppose one disease that would have been fairly prevalent early on, given in barley, I suppose the conditions that we had over the winter month, is mildew, and this is one that we go into crops now and it's it's relatively difficult to find the mildew now at this stage.
Even in winter barley, that you'd see kind of coming and going as this Leptoria nodorum. Did I hear a little bit of that kind of turning up over the last few weeks?
Indeed, yeah. Again, that comes down probably to variety aspect. A big component of it will be variety, but it is one that, look, it has been around for quite some years, and we've always picked up a small amount of it. But there is a little bit more this year. But again, is that probably reflecting on the conditions that we've had in springtime? It is there, again, getting into control programs. We have a good idea of what sort of chemistry will be working very effectively against it, and where it is timed rightly, it is providing some very, very good control.
I would imagine the majority of, or we would hope, I suppose, maybe all of the winter barley's fungicide program or disease control program is finished at this stage. If a farmer has seen a bit of nodorum down in the crop, should the farmer get excited about it and go back at that again, or is it just something to note rather than anything else?
I think at this stage it's something to note, being honest. You would look. I wouldn't be surprised if you're seeing things low down in the crop, be that nodorum, be that rhynchosporium, etc. You'd expect to see something down there. If it is creeping upwards, then look, it is a case will it even be stopped with chemistry now at this stage? Like how good will that penetration of a fungicide even be down into that lower sort of canopy? Anyhow, is the question. And again, it comes back to even the discussion that Ramularia would have, and that's one that we do start to see developing in the trials in the untreated. We do know that Ramularia is definitely there, and I suppose given the conditions that we've had over the last couple of weeks, it's one that I would expect to come true definitely in trials, and potentially where I suppose timings and things like that have gone amiss in terms of the in fungicide applications. But it's really about actually understanding, okay, well, what are we trying to do in barley? And it comes back to the discussion about timings, and what we're trying to do is trying to maximize yield. And we know yield is not just solely about being able to fill those grains at the very end. We have to have those grains at the very start. And there's probably a period after, I suppose, flowering is really what's critical to winter barley. And after a certain point, look, disease will come in. It's inevitable that Ramularia will probably come in towards the end of the season, but its impact hopefully will be relatively small. And we'd like to see that a lot of that grain filling or a lot of that photosynthesis that will occur in the next couple of weeks will be able to fill those grains.
I've often heard you talking, Stephen, about Ramularia and its propensity to come into crops when the crop has been stressed at some stage or other, and with the same breath, everything is a stress as far as they can make out in winter barley, whether it's sunny, whether it's cold, whether it's too dry, too wet, whatever. What's your assessment this year on Ramularia? What you've seen coming through trials for winter barley? Is there more or less than other years, or is it a bit early yet?
No, in the trials, just walking them yesterday, we can start to see Ramularia starting to bubble up in those untreated plots, or even in plots that I suppose have had fungicides that aren't providing good control. So it definitely is there. Now, the whole aspect about the stress, look, growing a crop is going to be stressful on the crop, full stop. And one of the major components, of course, is going to be then rainfall and leaf wetness and things like this. And unfortunately, we've had those over the last couple of weeks. So conditions have been, I suppose, maybe not as bad in terms of stress, in terms of hot, cold and things like that. But we've had the rainfall. We've had those events to actually allow that disease to develop. So it would be one that I would expect in the next 2 weeks, we would start to see some rapid development of Ramularia. Especially, look, if the forecast is to be believed, in the next week, we are going to get a bit more sun and a bit higher temperatures. That in itself will exacerbate the disease also to a certain extent.
Okay, we might switch just a little bit across maybe and just go to winter wheat just for a second, as winter barley's kind of finished, I suppose, for most people, but there's still a few actions on winter wheat. Just going back through the early season in winter wheat, yellow rust didn't seem to be the same problem this year as it was other years. Is that down to different weather conditions, farmers being that bit better, or is it simply a case of there was less varieties that were as susceptible?
I think it's a case of the latter. Basically, there's less varieties, the varieties are there, but there's less area sown to those varieties that are very susceptible. And look, the one that springs to mind is Bennington and JB Diego. Look, from a yellow rust perspective, we have trials in Oak Park. We're looking at different treatments, and Bennington is in there for that. And it's like a chessboard. Looking out, you can see that those plots that didn't receive any fungicide treatment, those Bennington plots are yellow. So it's not a case that actually conditions were different. I suppose the biggest effect would have been the varieties that are very susceptible were not so into it. Now, that said, our varieties, Graham is taking a major chunk of, I suppose, the wheat acreage, and it has some susceptibility, but it's just not that super susceptible such as Bennington.
So I suppose it's a constant case of farmers being aware of maybe the new varieties they're going to bring on farm to ensure that level of resistance is inbuilt into the variety rather than trying to rely on chemistry to control it thereafter.
Absolutely. I think, look, it's a case that if a variety has a known extremely weak sort of susceptibility to the yellow rust, then it is a no. It's a case on, look, there will be varieties that come out that are very resistant, but unfortunately we do know populations and pathogens can evolve, so it's inevitable that some of these may break down. But if we're actually starting knowing that we're going in with this very susceptible variety, if we're taking that risk and saying we're going to have to go with all this chemistry, that's a risk for me that would be too far.
Okay. I think growers would probably agree that this year has been pretty good in terms of the weather that allowed the correct timings of some of the major fungicides, the leaf 3 and the flagleaf fungicides. And with the result, is this being, or is this coming out, if you like, in your trials, Stephen, in terms of there's relatively low disease pressure in terms of Septoria there, or am I mistaken in that?
I think it is a case of, again, looking at the variety. And we really have two big varieties in the market at the moment. And Graham is the biggest, if it takes the most area. That has a rating of 6 for Septoria. And that is showing itself, because we can compare that with Costello in our trials in Oak Park, which is regarded, I suppose, as a medium pressure site, where we're actually seeing Septoria up on flag leaves of Costello in some plots of the untreated, I should say. While Graham, we're struggling to see it on that leaf too. So that aspect of resistance is being built into the system, and that is a really important component. Timings are only as good as, I suppose, the aspect of actually the variety. So we need to be working with the variety to get those timings and exacerbate the effect that we might get from those timings. And to put this in context, I mean, in terms of when we look at that aspect of having the disease, say, whether it's on very low levels on leaf 2 compared to a variety that has it on the flag leaf, that can be worked back in terms of even when we're talking about that leaf tree application and things like that. We could expect in Costello that disease would have been a little bit higher. We would have been putting that leaf tree application under a little bit more pressure, a bit more sort of relying on it a little bit more than we would have, say, in the Graham. And that will have a knock-on consequence for the amount of disease that would be bubbling away there. And look, the timings, in a lot of situations, you might think the timings have been right. But I think what we saw between that leaf tree and flag leaf was extremely rapid growth. And that, I suppose, might have caught a few people out in terms of, look, the flag leaf was out, and it hasn't been ideal conditions in some places to get those flag leaf sprays applied. It has been quite windy, there's been quite broken weather, quite showery. So it is about actually looking, making sure that is timed as close as perfect as right. And the built-in sort of aspect of resistance that we would have that little bit in Graham, a bit more than we would have in Costello, will have an impact. Now, when I say there's a bit more in Graham, look, we would like to have a lot more, being honest, because we do know that coming, it's a long way to the middle of grain filling. Even sure, it's a long way to harvest. And we do know that, look, the untreated Graham, we will have a lot of disease come the start of July, I'd expect.
And Stephen, we'll finish off on the winter wheats just in terms of maybe the final fungicides. But before I get there, just when you're talking about Septoria, in your trials or what you're seeing coming through, or maybe you're seeing more generally, is there, not a magic solution necessarily, but is there any sort of step change with some of the varieties that are coming through that will give us a much better Septoria or maybe overall disease package to help this disease control?
No doubt. There is definitely varieties that are coming through. They're in national lists, they're in recommended list trials that have a much better Septoria. And I think that is something that we do need. But we know from, I suppose, our trials over the last 10, 15 years, that I suppose there's two things that, look, even if we have an improvement in resistance, we still do see a very significant yield response from fungicides. But also, I suppose the last couple of years have demonstrated to us that actually varieties, we need to start thinking about how we can protect varieties. Just like we need to think about protecting fungicides from anti-resistance, we need to think about how we protect our varieties from virulence breakdown. We've seen some very big cases of actually some varieties that were really, really hopeful. We expected to take them a big chunk of the market, and Septoria has broken them before they even got going. So it is something that we have to be aware of, that, yeah, there's definitely some good resistance coming. We need to start thinking about how we might protect that. And that is something that we are doing, and we will be looking at into the next couple of years.
Okay. So just on the last bit on winter wheat, just to give you two scenarios, and you might maybe answer them as regards this scenario. So we can get into a scenario whereby perhaps we've maybe broken to wet weather around that critical time for putting on the final fungicide around early flowering kind of stage, being one scenario. And then the other scenario might be that, look, it's relatively benign weather, it's relatively dry, not a huge amount of rain around. For each of those two different scenarios, is there a very different approach, or is it still, look, protect what you have, whack on a great big load of fungicide and away we go? Or is there a little bit more of a nuance in that in terms of putting more or less on?
The whole aspect about Fusarium is that, look, we need to be able to protect the head as it is flowering. That's its weakness. We know that it won't all flower in one go. So we know that from a fusarium perspective, that the fungicide is only as effective as the timing. So and we try and maximize that by going at a time where actually most of the crop is actually flowering, or as most as possible. Therefore, I suppose we always talk about maybe 50% or 60% efficacy of fusarium control if the conditions are really sort of conducive to fusarium. So in that sort of scenario, you are trying to maximize it as much as possible. And if you have that broken weather, it is about basically trying to get that fungicide on as best as is possible. Look, if you have really benign weather, look, I would say, the risk of fusarium really lowers, and what we are using for fusarium is all component. It is going to be something like Brazaro type, where you have prothioconazole and you have tebuconazole. They are components that we are using elsewhere in the program. So the aspect about just whacking them on and sort of only touching fusarium, it's going to hit every pathogen that we're looking at there, and it could have consequences for resistance into next year. But I am aware, look, in terms of the year that's in it, we are looking at scenarios where there's a high wheat price and things like that. So it is going to be a case of, look, what I'd say, broken weather, yeah, it's going to be a scenario where you're going to have to try and get out a good rate to go out there. In very benign weather, it is going to be about, okay, what is the risk of fusarium coming in? Is it fairly low? Being honest, I suppose the other aspect, as all it's discussed about, is the impact of septoria at that time. And I think, look, it is, when we talk about septoria, it's really now in that flag leaf. What happens in that flag leaf is really what's going to be important, because we're trying to get control up past, in terms of past that flowering stage. And after that, look, septoria will cycle. Undoubtedly, we'll get some coming in, but its impact on yield we see is relatively low. And equally, what we're putting on for fusarium control, we know that its efficacy against septoria is significantly weakened.
So, Stephen, the differential then, just to be clear about the differential between the final fungicide, then is 100% in the high situations versus 80% in the lower, or is it 80 versus 60? Where is it?
It would be the 100%, I think, in terms of that very high situation, that broken weather. But we're trying to maximize the control of the different fusarium species that are going to be there. It is a case then, if it is less broken, a bit more benign, that yeah, you can reduce that rate.
So just going back to oats, again, growers would probably report that, God, it's been a relatively easy enough year to control disease so far in oats. Would that be the experience in trials as well?
In the trials, look, the diseases in oats that we're really talking about are mildew and crown rust. And from a trials perspective, look, we've plenty of mildew, and the varieties that we are sort of growing are very susceptible to mildew. And being honest, there's crown rust. There is crown rust about because of that mild winter and very mild spring, and May has been exceptionally warm. So there is a bit there, but the chemistry that we're using is quite effective. So it's about getting that chemistry in and getting it on at the right time. And in most scenarios, I think it has done a very good job.
So on winter oats, they're probably the majority of them are either headed out or just about heading out at the moment. Is that the correct stage for applying the final fungicide, or should growers wait a little bit longer to make sure they get really good coverage of the entire head?
Yeah, so this is, I suppose, there's two aspects to this in terms of what we're trying to do, and a lot of what we're trying to do at this stage is actually to provide foliar disease control, and maybe also a little bit of that fusarium control. So if we're thinking it from a foliar disease, and we're talking about that mildew, and we're talking about rust, which can cycle really rapidly in the type of conditions that we're having at the moment, bit of moisture, bit of heat, it is about actually making sure that we're on top of those. So it is almost a complication or a compromise to try and make sure that we're tackling the foliar and maybe getting some fusarium. Now, I think if we leave it till the head is completely fully out and flowering and chase the fusarium, we may run into difficulties with whether it's mildew or that crown rust. So it's really, as the head is just about out, is really the ideal time. So we're trying to capture both as much as possible, really probably tipping on the side of the foliar disease more than on the fusarium.
And does the same stand for winter and spring oats?
It would, being honest, in terms of the winter, you might have an extra application earlier on, because the I suppose the duration between, I suppose, before you get into that stem extension will be longer than it would be in the spring oats.
So maybe finally then we'll touch maybe back on spring barley, because obviously it's a very big crop, and look, the majority of spring barley varieties, they're all, I suppose, aimed towards the malting market. Whether to make it or not is a different thing, but they have a potential to go there. So fairly well dominated by the likes of Planet, I suppose, out there, and a number of others. What's the story this year in terms of diseases coming through? Is it high so far or lower? What way do you think it is?
So the one thing about the spring barley is that previously we would have probably always talked about maybe mildew as a major concern in spring barley. Recommended list gives us a very high rating for spring barley for mildew, and that has come true. That actually, look, we can be confident and say that mildew is not a concern in these guys. A lot of them, and that's because they're based on genetic resistance, based on what's called an MLO. In the other diseases, then again, it comes back to actually the recommended list has given us that information, and we can start to see that coming through in terms of the trials. So one that would be, I suppose, a little bit about would be net blotch, and especially, I suppose, given the weather conditions, it would be one that I might see, or you might think would increase a little bit more over the coming weeks potentially. And again, Rinko is also there in the background. So it's really, at the moment, it is really those two diseases. They are definitely bits about, and I suppose Planet being slightly more susceptible to net blotch, it would be one that I would be concerned about, or maybe not concerned about, but keeping an eye on, especially at that first application. When we get through to the second application, it is going to be a case of actually looking for, again, the susceptibility that might be in the variety, Planet net blotch, if there's susceptibility to Rhynchosporium, and also, of course, look, Ramularia. Ramularia would be the one that could come in very quickly. Again, it will depend on the conditions from now through to maybe the middle or latter half of June. But it would be one that would, I suppose, we should be looking at and thinking about.
So with the net blotch you talk about, is there any chance that can reappear or pop back up later in the season, especially if it's a little bit wet, and be of concern to growers?
Absolutely. Most definitely. I think it's a case, look, we know that within the spring barley, the first application, if we have disease bubbling away there and we allow it to develop, it can cause significant yield hit straight away, even if we do come back in with a second application. But likewise, that if we get very good control early on, it doesn't mean that it won't come back in. It will very much depend on what happens over the next few weeks, whether it'll come back in. And it is one that does need to be looked at and sort of treated in accordance to what's happening in the field and the weather conditions that are going to be prevailing.
And Stephen, maybe finally, I suppose it's very well accepted that the final fungicide is going to contain a mix of various different actives, the likes of Folpit plus something, whether it's an azole plus an STHI or a Straub or a QII. So we know that's going to go in there. But I think what's probably a little bit more confusing, maybe, or maybe there's mixed messages out in the industry, it's in terms of the timing of that last fungicide. There still appears to be a lot of growers, perhaps encouraged, maybe more so, but the practice would certainly suggest that they are applying that final fungicide when the heads are fully out. But that runs contrary to what you've been saying, what we've been saying in Teagasc for the last, I don't know, the guts of 6 or 7 years, I suppose, at least now. Why should people go that little bit earlier?
I suppose I suppose the advice that we're coming out with is coming from two sort of streams. It's coming from the fungicide sort of timing work that we would have conducted back maybe 4 or 5 years ago, where we have all the different combinations of timings, and that would show the yield. But also the second stream is actually coming then from some research work, physiologically looking at actually what's happening, how is barley creating its yield, and those two combined basically say that actually, look, we need to make sure that we protect those tillers early on and try and maximize the potential grain sites, and then it is about the grain filling. But we know that actually the barley crop will create probably enough photosynthate, so basically enough sugars and things like that within a short enough period after flowering that actually after a certain point, I can't say exactly what that point will be, but after a certain point, actually, if disease comes in, if we start to lose those leaves, their impact on yield is relatively small. Now, that sort of, you can work it way back then and sort of say, okay, well, how do we protect those? It's about making sure that we have those timings correct to actually when we need that green leaf. So that last timing, for example, if we're leaving that run until the head is fully out, that'll give us, okay, a point from that head fully out onwards for disease control. But we know the big disease that we're tackling now is ramularia, and we know that actually that will starting to develop shortly after flowering, because that flowering is a huge sort of pressure. But it will have been in the crop before that. So what we're trying to do is actually hit it that little bit earlier, which will basically make sure that actually when that crop hits that huge stress event that will be that flowering, that actually we've got that protection has already been built in, if you know what I mean, from that sort of time. And that's why we would be going that little bit earlier in terms of the on-emerging.
Tax, Steve, and you think about that, what's the yield differential that have been measured in trials in comparison to going very late, as we would call it, with the head fully out versus going at the timings that you're recommending, which is the paintbrush stage or as the heads are just emerging? What's the differential in terms of yield?
So this will all depend on the season that's going to be there, being honest. If you have a really ramularia conducive season, look, you will get some control of ramularia later when you go that late when the head is fully out. However, it's not ideal, and you run the risk of actually ramularia coming in and causing significant damage. To give an absolute yield would be very difficult. We can say exactly what ramularia, if we don't do anything, we'll give, and that could be up to 1.5 tons. So if you're allowing it to come in that little bit earlier, there definitely is some component, some part of that 1.5 tons that you will lose. Now, how much that will be will, of course, depend on that season. But it's really about that aspect of actually, look, if we think about it in terms of that flowering, that big stress, that's when ramularia will be running riot. We want to be making sure that actually that ramularia doesn't have a chance to get to that point.
We run through the crop reports and various other different things. We have some trials from yourselves that is down at 0.4 of a ton. So look, it's if we can manage to maybe nail it to something like that we have a trial that's 0.4 of a ton, which is the guts of 130 euros a hectare, that's the type of money differential you're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. And that if you take of those trials, Michael, as I say, there will be an amalgamation of different trials over a number of different years. Some of those individual trials that might be greater.
Yeah, so look, it's something that's all to be played for certainly out there at the moment in fields, and look, there certainly is two aspects to it. As far as listening to you, Stephen, today is getting the timings right is certainly one thing, but choice of products or choice of actives, I should say, rather than products are still very important. But I suppose the other maybe major thing, I suppose, between here and maybe next season even, because we always do have to be looking forward, is to pick your varieties and pick what you're going to put in the field, because that'll dictate what happens later on in season. That's exactly what I was going to say, Michael. I think that is a critical component, and my advice would be over the next couple of weeks is to actually go and see how successful your program has been this year in your own crops. But if you can get into trials that are looking at varieties and seeing what's in your local area, trials that might be in your local area that have different varieties, and getting a feel for what might be there is very important, because that is a decision that's going to come very fast, and it has a big implication for the following season. Great, Stephen. Thanks very much. Always a pleasure to have you on the podcast. And look, we'll chat to you shortly again. Perfect. So that's all we've time for. And my thanks to Stephen for joining me today in the podcast. Teagasc are running a series of walks in both the Teagasc Boer Malt Joint Programme, but also the Enable Conservation Tillage Project over the next number of weeks. These farm walks will go across a number of the focus farms across Ireland, from Louth to Kildea. The first walk will start on Wednesday, June the 1st in Garraculligans in Stabannon, County Louth. These walks will look at the conversion process from ploughing into non-plough based establishment systems, but really will also look at the grass weeds that are a problem on many of these farms and how to control these grass weeds. For more information on all of these walks, go to teagasc.ie/tillage month. So finally, don't forget, if you enjoyed this podcast, and recommend it to a friend or colleague. And as always, rate, review, and follow on Apple Podcast or Spotify so you never miss an episode. And for more information, go to teagasc.ie. I'm Michael Hennessy. Thanks for listening. I'll be back next week with more tillage news and advice.